Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining for today's Race and Energy Series webinar. My name is Clayton Johnson. I'm the Communications Manager here at Pecan Street. And today, our CEO, Suzanne Russo, is going to be talking with author and NYU professor, Dr. Charlton McIlwain, about his recent book, Black Software. So we're going to give folks just a minute or two to join, and then we'll go ahead and kick things off, and I'll hand things over to Suzanne. So sit tight for just 1 minute. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. I will let people know we're having a little bit of issues getting Dr. McIlwain's video started, but we're going to keep working on that, and hopefully we'll be able to get him on screen soon. But we have his audio, so we'll still be able to talk with him. And with that, I will hand it over to Suzanne Russo to get us started.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We're really thrilled about today's conversation with Charlton. If you haven't read his book, Black Software, I highly recommend that you grab a copy and try to read it over the holidays. There's a wealth of information included in the book and a lot of really amazing, thought-provoking insights. So we're going to spend probably about the first half of the webinar today just chatting about the book and some of the surprises that Charlton uncovered in his research. We're going to talk about the narrative style and the intentionality behind that, and have Charlton talk with us a bit about the themes and the direction of, hi, good to see your face.
There we go.
Yeah, the themes of the book and the implications for the software industry writ large, but also the ability to think about how do we use software, how do we develop it with intentionality and use tools like the internet to also serve as a cultural resource. And I am just excited to get started. So we'll dig in now, if that's okay. And Charlton, can you just introduce yourself and given us an overview of the book and what you hope people take away from reading it? And then I will also just say, as a kind of a housekeeping thing, I'll do my best to cover questions that are raised in the chat feature. So if you do want to ask Charlton a question, just post it there, and Clayton will be helping us keep an eye on that and moderating it. And if you can't stay for the whole talk today, this video will also be recorded and put on Pecan Street's YouTube page, probably by the end of the week. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And Charlton, I'll let you take it away.
Perfect. Thank you for having me. First of all, always happy to talk to you and talk about the book. So I'm a professor of media, culture, and communication here at NYU. I, for about the last 8 to 10 years, have been really fascinating in studying and other things, issues at the intersection of race, racial justice, and technology. And that's how Black Software really began. And it's interesting to sort of talk about the trajectory of the book, because it is one that ended up in a very different place than where I imagined it would be at the very beginning. So it started as a way for me to account for things like Black Lives Matter, very powerful, enduring social racial justice movements. And so I was interested at the very beginning in how did this happen? How did Black Lives Matter kind of out of the blue hit us in such a powerful way and with such great impact, something that really had not happened since the late 1960s in terms of civil rights organizing and action and so forth. So I was interested in how that happened, and I was mostly interested in how digital technology facilitated that work. So the people that were doing the work, how they organized it, how they created the engagement, the visibility that really propelled the movement. So that was a question I went into when I started down this road to write the book. Then through different ways that I'm sure that we'll talk about, the book took on a life of its own, and took me down a very long historical path, which is what I had not originally anticipated. But it became less about Black Lives Matter per se, though that was still kind of in view as a motivation, but it was more what has been the long relationship between Black people and computing technology over a longer historical trajectory. And then what can that tell us about our current state of affairs, how we push for racial justice, how we think about technology and racial justice as part and parcel, the same things. And so that's where the book ended. And, I always have to point out the irony that for a book that started really about Black Lives Matter, I mentioned it in my introduction, and then I tell a brief story about it in the final chapter. And then what's in between is all the historical stuff that I think informs, those movements and others in our future in terms of racial justice.
That is really interesting how much the book evolved from your original interest. And it really does read as if it has a life of its own. I want to dive a bit more, I think, into the substance of the book and what you uncovered. And then if we could talk a bit about the narrative style of it. So the book, when I opened the book, I really came at it from the perspective of software developer. And we do a lot of software development, and we work with a lot of software companies here at Pecan Street. As energy becomes more and more about information and data, it's really data management for energy management these days. And as Pecan Street, our mission is to accelerate the transition to clean energy. And a lot of that requires intensive and new kinds of software to manage these distributed resources in a different way. And with everything that's been happening over the past several years with Black Lives Matter that you touched on, we've been trying to think more intentionally here at our organization about how do we ensure that we are centering this work about climate action, particularly with technology development around racial justice and just concepts of fairness and equity. And so I came at the book with that lens and, was thinking, well, I was very surprised, I'll say, by a lot of my takeaway was less around how do companies evolve to think about equity and fairness and designing their products for racial justice as an outcome, or at least racial equity as an outcome, and more about the amazing creative force of Black Americans organizing for themselves with these new tools and technologies. And that really being a driving force more than the impact of Black Americans at IBM, for example, which you talk a lot about in the book, and that is really powerful. But the things that really struck me were just the amazing influence and impact of Black Americans organizing for themselves and how that really did shape and direct what the internet became. And really perversely at the same time, when these tools and resources became open on the internet, you talk, for example, about, I think it was one of the first forums online that was really designed to be a place for conversation of things of concern / of interest. That's a point that's made in the book for African Americans. And then it just immediately was a forum for hate, or at least a lot of challenge, and it wasn't a safe place for Black Americans. And that really perpetuated till this day.
Right.
And I wonder if you could talk about that, about, what you learned in researching this incredibly rich history between Black America and the internet and software, um, and how you think that other entities and companies, what we should learn from that to take forward to better achieve the objectives of racial justice with technology development and also within technology development. And one of the things I think that I'm talking about or trying to allude to is, I don't want to say tension, but I guess in my mind, I'm still working through it, is thinking about it as an integrative process versus thinking about it and understanding it as really different life experiences, and that that manifests in a need for a different space or different set of tools for Black America versus perhaps white corporate America.
Right. Yeah, it's a big sort of question and setup, but it's a good one because I think,
Okay.
it hits at the heart of what I was trying to communicate in the book, that had everything to do with this sort of, trying to peel back the layers a bit to see a kind of openness with which we come at and connect to technology. In the software environment, hardware environment, infrastructural environment, however our approach is, but to sort of step back and kind of tell a story about moments in which all of these things were not sort of already determined in a lot of ways, where we hadn't already sort of made the decisions about how we were going to use these things and to what ends, and what problems we were going to try to use software and technology more generally to solve. And that's where I started to kind of develop and see sort of two things playing out. And that first one that really grabbed hold of me was precisely this moment where you have a group of people, African American folks, largely in the 70s, 80s, increasingly in the 90s, and so forth, who, I like the approach of thinking about sort of software in the same way that we think about other technologies like radio, right? And the impulse to sort of just see this thing that I don't know really what it is or what it's for, but it seems fascinating to me, and largely because I see myself being able to make something out of it, or being able to influence and use it as a tool to make something that I want, right? And that works for me, that's of interest to me, that helps me solve a particular problem. And then to see it play out, what and how that people shape that technology and go on to use it. And part of what was interesting for me as I talked to people and started to engage with what it was that they were doing with and within the software environment in these early days of computer networking, was to see that fascination with nothing sort of predetermined. And it was interesting because I often went and my questions were really about, tell me about the software that you were building and using in the community and the racial justice and the politics and so forth. And often people were like, I was really just trying to connect with somebody 3 states away that I thought I might want to have a conversation with, or spark a love interest and so forth. And so I built, little things that help, us communicate or play in this kind of environment that existed at the time, but to sort of come at it from no preconceptions about what software or technology was intended to do, and a realization that what technology does has everything to do with that intentionality, meaning what we want it to do, right? It exists as a tool. And we come to technology in its design and building and so forth to do certain things, but those things are not predetermined. And so I think part of the book for me that was fascinating was seeing two very intentional things playing out. Black folks who were very intentional about using technology to help fuel their connection with other Black people, and that having and being an end of itself with some other outcomes and so forth. But with the end of itself being simply, I want to connect, and here's a tool that allows me to connect, and I can see my own interests and creativity and culture in this thing, because I can create, I can use image software to create GIFs to communicate, hip hop environment and culture that I'm interested in, right? But I can bend it to my sort of will and interest in that kind of way. On the flip side, the part of the book that shows the very explicit intentionality of those that were part of corporations, the government, et cetera, that said, look, we have very explicit use of these technological tools and software because our problem is greater, and it's one about crime, and that problem of crime has everything to do with people that we see as the primary perpetrators of crime, and then to follow that path of where that ends up and the problems to which it leads. But I think what we often lose sight of today when we think about technological production and about software making and building is that transparency and openness, right? About what went into it, what was I motivated to do and build when I started to design and then deploy this technology. And so to peel that back, even, and particularly on the corporate and government side, to a day when people were not predisposed to, risk aversion and so forth, and to sort of need to mask and hide all of those sort of malintentions, to see very clearly people that said, look, we have a problem. It's a problem about crime. That's often people who are concentrated in urban areas, who are Black, brown, poor, etc. And they are doing things that we consider criminal and deviant, and we want to control that. And here we have new tools of computing and software to bring to bear on that problem, and to sort of see that kind of intentionality play out both in that original instance and where it's led us in a very straight line to, in terms of our surveillance infrastructure and much more today. I think that is instructive. And I think it's instructive in the way that tells us, if we can intentionally do something like that, that has such negative impacts over a long period of time, we could do the other. We could make a decision to do something different with the technology that we design and build, and asking different questions about why we're building it and to what ends. And I think that's where, I think the pivot around thinking about software, and I think your word is very much appropriate in terms of the intentionality of both what do I want it to do and what don't I want it to do, and thinking ahead to say what might happen as a result of me building, deploying a certain kind of software tool, and having the foresight to be able to say, all right, I can foresee what's coming down the pike. It doesn't look good. It's not altogether positive. And then being able to say, all right, we're going to say, no, we're not going to do it. Or we're going to go back to the drawing board and design differently for different outcomes. Probably a longer answer to your question than you.
It was great. I mean, part of me wants to say, I'm not going to ask any more questions. You just talk, but the rest of the time.
Don't do that, because who knows where I'll end up, but.
There's so much here. I want to talk just a little bit more about the history that you bring to light in the book. And one of the things that I learned that was just fascinating was through, Black entrepreneurs and Black programmers really seeing that there's this new tool, the internet and software, and then, creating the space for communication and just cultural education and resources, that was really the first major pivot from the internet as just this research tool and resource sharing tool to this cultural development, cultural creation space. And and it was done in this really democratic way of bringing together people. Let's all agree on the intention of this space and what we wanted to do. Let's set up some rules and let's launch it and let's have these conversations with that intentionality. And that democratic approach was really perverted then when this amazing opportunity that, again, that Black Americans had created to use the internet in this way was formalized, right, into this really hyper political space, and this business space, and then turned into a tool that, as you were talking about a little bit, really has ended up hurting a lot of minorities in the country, but particularly Black Americans. And to pivot away from that, I mean, trying to think about what we can learn from the history there and what the internet has become today, and social media in particular. How do you think that opportunity could present itself, or that shift could happen to have an equally impactful but positive impact on America?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it was interesting. I was talking to a group yesterday that's an activist organization, but kind of part of both sort of looking at kind of racial and economic justice in connection with technology and technology environment, as well as sort of kind of labor movement organizing and so forth. And so it's a kind of a similar conversation that begins with that realization of the story in the book of when I say, there was a kind of quote unquote golden age, if there it was ever such a thing, in this kind of early 90s, mid 90s moment that then abruptly ends by basically the end of the 90s. And early on, I had a chapter that was titled in the book, Remember When the Internet Was Black. And I ended up dropping the title from the chapter, but the sentiment.
Oh, so good.
I should have kept it, but it was one of those things that falls away as you're trying to edit and organize and so forth. But it encapsulated sort of two things for me. Number one, I think the surprise, the wonder, the kind of discovery moment of, as this thing that we know as the internet begins to take that shift from research, scientific tool to public, in some ways commercial space, that the technology itself transforms as well. Meaning, early on, I was struck by something I found in a volume that I think was called something like a Encyclopedia of African American Invention or Technology or something like that. And I naturally looked up internet, and there was this paragraph that just jumped out at me that says something like, no Black people have ever been a part of the substantive creation, development of the internet from, da 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 da. And this was written by a group of scholars, all of whom were African American. And I was just struck by how could you say this, right? Number one, it can't be real. It can't be accurate. So how could you come up with such a sweeping statement? And I think in part the answer to that question is because we continue to think about the internet as its original incarnation as that technology, right? So I'm looking only at the hardware, the software, the connections that make it possible as a network, a computer network, right? And that's generally how we defined and framed the internet from its inception in the 60s up through the late 80s and dawn of the web. But we know that when we move from that early time period to the web as we know it, what really powers the internet itself is not the hardware and software per se, the material items that make the connection possible. It is users, number one, and then what users produce in and as they take advantage of and engage in this new space. And so it becomes much more something that is cultural than material. And that is where I sort of, particularly with the advent of net noir, which I talk about a lot in the book, as kind of a highlight moment of a sort of first very commercially viable internet space that was by and for and built on Black cultural production. And to see the moment that, I try to, I don't know that I communicate the kind of moment that it really meant for me to kind of discover it. I don't think it quite comes across in the telling, but to think about a moment in the early 90s when people are saying, all right, there's this new technological thing, it's called the internet, we can put stuff on it and content and people can see it, right? And to think what that meant, which was not a whole lot for people that were then trying to say, all right, how can we make money from this? How can this be commercially viable? And there was a period of time where, people talk about, folks just thought, well, maybe I could just throw the phone book on here and digitize it, and that would be great. And it was just sort of a information dump. And so it took, for someone like an AOL to say, all right, if this is going to be commercially viable, we got to have people that use it. And we don't have users, and we don't have people who are paying money for the computer system, the hardware, the modem, et cetera, et cetera. So we need a way to convince them that there's something here for them, that there's a reason to shell out money for a subscription to AOL or a similar service. And to think that that came with a net noir, right? That Black culture and Black cultural production was at the center of ushering masses of new users to this new technology that before then did not have that user constituency. And to see the ways in which Black people and Black culture were at that time at the very center of what then develops into the internet as we know it today. Number one, that was utterly mind-blowing to me, right? And then, of course, the question becomes, in the 20, 25 years since, what we see is the persistence of Black cultural production that powers the web, but we don't see Black people at the center of it in the ways that they were in the 90s. So we still acknowledge the value of Black cultural production and its popularity, and we see that in your Black Twitter environments or your TikToks or other areas of digital life, but the same people are not designing those spaces, not building the software tools, most importantly, not profiting from what's being distributed. So I've probably talked long enough to lose sight of your original question, but only to say, I think those two things about the centrality of Black culture and Black people's ability to participate in how that gets shaped, across long periods of time and profit from it is something that we lost in that sort of formative moment in the early mid 90s to our present, where I think, the very key development has been just simply expansion, right? We experimented for a while to try to figure out how we're going to make this a commercially viable technology and space and entity. And as soon as we did, that's when things took off, and that's when a lot of other people were left behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's an important theme to really be explicit about in the book, is the pioneering role of Black entrepreneurs and programmers at every stage of the development of the internet and software. And then the value of that, I think, really kind of being snatched away, and that value never being given to the people who for the pioneers. And with talking about Black culture continuing to really be a driving force in generating the content that users are coming to the internet for, but that value is not, the centrality of it and the value is not remitted in an appropriate way. Do you have any thoughts about, how do you solve for that?
Yeah, the $1 million question. I think there's a couple of very easy, and I mean easy to identify, not easy to solve things, which is, I think we have to go back to a moment of acknowledging that value. That is that Black folks, other people of color have bring a lot of value to the sort of technology field, to the software environment, have a lot to add. And so to both acknowledge that, but then say we're going to put our capital behind those people as well, right? That's what we had in that sort of key early moment. You had both people who had the value associated with their skill, their ability to develop software, the cultural aspects that really powered it and how it was deployed and used, and that people during that moment, Black folks had opportunity, either in terms of bootstrapping their own ventures and being successful, or getting venture capital to invest in the development of that software and those tools, to be able to propel and make a lot of things happen. I think what we're missing today is the capital in. And that was one of the questions that was brought up in my conversation yesterday, which was really, we talk a lot about the sort of problem of representation, whether those are in tech companies or in tech jobs, throughout many different sectors, and what's missing. And, on my end, what I see is not a dearth of people of color with the software development skills, the tools, the creativity, etc. It's that there's a profound lack of support, financially primarily, and investment in those people to go out and make something happen and to do something, and not just in kind of the small piecemeal ways in which typical entrepreneurial ventures start and generally fail and so forth, but to think about the kind of capital we put behind the large scale technology internet ventures that we see today, where a company like Facebook may spend billions of dollars on things that are going to fail. It's just experimentation. It's just research and development. It's the space to try things. This doesn't work. That doesn't work. We're going to kill that. We're not going to go forward with this, that, and the other. And what you get from that is ultimately the development of something big, impactful, because you've had the space and support to do that. And most Black entrepreneurs today, particularly those in the technology space, lack the underlying capital, for one, to even start those kinds of ventures. And I think it's something, the statistic is something like less than 1% of venture capital dollars that go to Black founders to even start these entrepreneurial ventures. But then to have the kind of capital investment that says, all right, this idea may not move forward, but there's another, and here's a space to really build and have some trial and error and spend. So I think it's that level of capital investment that we need to put behind Black and brown tech entrepreneurs, developers, etc. And then on the flip side, to do so in a way that has a kind of openness to it, right? So where do we find all of these folks that are people of color and in the software development role? They're working at, the Facebooks of the world, the Amazons of the world, et cetera, and they're building things that power those companies' missions. And so part of what I'm suggesting is the road to, I think, a better future comes in not only the investment in Black technological production, but to do so with a kind of openness that says, here's a big pot of money, go see what you can build, right? That is, for good, that's impactful. And when I say for good, I think that's, good in terms of its impact on society, also good for the health, well-being, and financial security of individual people and developers. So to be able to have that kind of capacity, I think, is really the first big step in a better direction.
Mm-hmm. So an investment opportunity that's less about pitch me your idea, and if I like it, I might invest, and more about just investing in Black creativity. And
right. There's I think there's a moment in the book, and I think it's really about net noir as well, when then head of AOL, Ted Leonsis, who, when David and Malcolm came to him, I think he said something like, they could have come in and pitched me anything. I knew when they walked in the door in the first couple of minutes that I was going to back their venture, right? Because it had everything to do with them as a team, where their real interest was in terms of what they wanted to put out into the world and what they were going to create, and their ability to do that. And that was what they were investing in. And it was sort of a byproduct that it happened to be this internet site, called Net Noir, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's that kind of model that says, yeah, I'll listen to your idea, pitch it, but more it's, if I can see that spark somewhere, I'll back this idea and the next 10 that you have if that first one doesn't come to fruition, And I think that's the level of investment that says and speaks to our kind of a shift in terms of where our values lie and what direction, and if we want to really seriously move into a different direction. Because I think, the reality is we need software developers that can show us something different, right? It's hard, for someone like me, particularly after researching and writing a book like this. I'm generally cynical and pessimistic most of the time. So it's hard to see kind of a way forward, like what would be that thing that I could build that would really be a catalyst to something. I need somebody else to do that, right? And I need to then invest in someone who can come without all of those sort of blinders on and show me something different that we can sort of get behind. And so I think that's the kind of investment we need to make in new generations of software developers and technology workers.
mm-hmm. Yeah, so less about a focus on racial representation and existing large companies, and in that paradigm, and the solution probably is more about disruption and investing in Black entrepreneurs that can create that disruption.
Absolutely. And I think there's value in both. I think we need to be pursuing both of those lines simultaneously, but I think the bigger bang for our buck and the bigger value in terms of trying to disrupt and really put ourselves on a very different path comes in that other framework.
Yeah, it's exciting. So you and I met a couple years ago at a conference, and there'll be a thread to this with our conversation. But so Charlton and I were at a conference together, and it's a funny conference. It's called Food Camp, and the first night that everybody's together, you crowdsource the agenda for the rest of the weekend. And I somehow hoodwinked Charlton into co-leading a session with me on racial representation and research data sets. And at the time at Pecan Street, I had realized that overwhelmingly 99% of the people in our data set, which our data is used by thousands of researchers around the world to create energy policy, that 99% of the people in that data set were white, upper middle class households. and that data being used around the world to create policy was problematic.
Right.
And I wanted to understand, was this just a pervasive problem across all research domains that use information about how people live, or how are other people solving this problem? Or was it even a problem was tying race to, as an indicator to the individuals in our data set, going to create more problems than it would solve? And that was an eye-opening conversation for me because that was really the first time that I think started to become aware that I can think of race as a social construct and have this kind of post-racial, had come at it a bit with this post-racial, aren't we beyond that lens, to really being very much schooled on when you're Black, it's not a social construct, it's a part of your life, and it really defines your lived experience. And that really stood out to me a lot in the book that you wrote. And that there is just this value that you're not going to achieve any other way in letting and enabling, and I don't want to say letting, but investing in Black Americans to create solutions for their own communities. And I'm sure similarly in letting Africans create solutions for their own communities in Nigeria and Kenya and South Africa, every country in the world, rather than trying to think about it from this lens of, we need to be better integrated as one software development community with better racial representation. And I hear you saying both have value, but that really, when we talk about these big, exciting, catalytic changes that can get software, and particularly the internet, back on a path of being about opportunity and cultural celebration and cultural growth, rather than an oppressive tool that's used by one sector of society to monitor, for example, another sector of society, that requires really embracing this idea that race does define a lot of your lived experience in this country, and therefore the ideas that you're going to have and the way you're going to approach solutions and the way you're going to see problems. But that's a conversation I still have a lot in my world when we talk about policy development in particular, is whether or not using race as an indicator in policy, or racial justice specifically as an outcome, is beneficial or hurtful. And can't we just get at it with income and create a more inclusive, solutions-based approach versus separating out individuals by race? And I wonder if you would be willing to tackle that a little bit here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I've been talking more and more about it, particularly in sort of the industry context, and in the context of, how do we do better, right? So this is all come in that kind of framework of companies, in energy sector, in the financial sector, in health and medical sectors, of how can we do things differently? And my response is often, as a first thing, that if doing something differently, you really have in mind doing things differently that have different outcomes on particular groups of people, then we have to be able to name what that is, right? So if we acknowledge that our policies, practices, technological development have disparately impacted certain groups of people, we can think no further back than, looking at our current situation with COVID, right? Where the stark outcomes for communities of color, African American communities, indigenous communities is so disparate. Then if the problem is racially specific, racially group specific, then our solution has to also have that sort of specificity. So it doesn't make sense for me, because I think what we see in our history is that this notion that we will create something that will work for all people always ends up working for certain people more than others, and typically disadvantaging certain people more than others. This is a case when we think, back out to the whole sort of deployment of the internet and internet technology and so forth in the 90s, where Clinton and the policy community, both in sort of commerce and elsewhere, were saying, hey, this could be a revolutionary tool, and we're going to make sure that everyone has access to it. We're going to make sure it's a universal technology. And so there was this kind of universalism that we like to think about because it seems right. It seems to match our sort of democratic sensibilities. But what often, or not often, but almost always tends to play out is at the end of the day, those who are better positions to take advantage of that are who walk away with the advantages, and often either other folks don't have access to those opportunities or are negatively impacted by those things. So all of that to say, I think when we think about disruption, I don't see how that happens without a very clear focus on naming and talking through and having in full view at every stage of that sort of development the problem we're trying to ameliorate that has everything to do with race, racial discrimination, etc. And I don't know. I think it does have a sense in which, as you mentioned, sort of, as a African American man, to think about life in these terms seems utterly normal because I have never known anything different, right? This is sort of my life. But, obviously, good people who have different sensibilities, because it seems logically, if we're going to still continue down this sort of trap of thinking about everybody in sort of a racial box and category, then that could only lead to more XYZ. And then there are sort of folks that are a little, less well-intentioned, but with a similar view. I simply think we end up reproducing what we already have in terms of the status quo, and those who are locked out of opportunity or those who are disparately harmed and impacted by technology. And I think for me, the excitement about the future, the excitement when I talk to sort of new generations of software developers and so forth, is like seeing what could come out of something where our starting point is, can we build a software tool that is more racially just? Can we build a software tool that makes it more likely that communities of color have access to the kind of energy products that make their environment safer, more affordable, etc., and see what comes out of that? That's where the sort of frontier for me is. And I think if we can strip away some of our, political notions about what that might entail, I think we can see a way forward in trying to take some steps in the positive direction to how we ameliorate some of these problems that are obviously of our own making.
That's a great answer. It makes a lot of sense too. Thank you. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, and we do have a couple of audience questions, so I'm going to jump to those. But if we have more time, I also want to ask you about the narrative style of your book. And
Sure.
Again, I cannot emphasize enough how wonderful this book is. And I think everybody in the world should read it, but particularly if you work in any sector of technology or policy, it should just be required reading for everybody, because it's history and it's context that most people don't know about. It's really incredible that you uncovered it and have shared it in such a, I keep saying the word impact, but the way you brought the personal narratives together and the historical context was profound.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is a good question. They're all good questions, everybody in the audience. Thank you for submitting them. I'm just going to start at the bottom and work my way up. So first question is, are there policies that the Biden administration could advance that would support equity in the digital space? For example, universal broadband access.
Yes, and I think universal broadband access is a great first step, and I think that sort of pitches things towards how can we expand opportunity and access. On the corollary, I think a good first step is to think about the regulatory environment. What things can we put into place to make sure there's an even playing field? So if that's about sort of the kind of mega tech corporations, our Facebooks, Microsofts, and so forth of the world, and trying to create a more equitable space for other people to have viability in the market, I think that's a good first step. And another first step of just uh, being able to slow some of the development that's coming out, that's algorithmically driven, et cetera, where we don't fully understand the risk of harm, to have regulatory policies in place that says, hey, before you develop and distribute and really deploy this tool, wait, let us understand the full potential ramifications.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, next question is, given the role that social media played in driving the Black Lives Matter movement, especially after George Floyd's murder, are there new ways to use digital spaces to advance racial equity and justice?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think social media is a powerful tool. I think we've seen that, in and out with Black Lives Matter and related movements. And I think the primary value that comes from that is about both the level and sustained attention to an issue like race, and race in the context of crime or police violence and what have you. I have mixed feelings about sort of the social media space as a domain for doing much more than that. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the spaces and platforms as they currently exist aren't built for those purposes, really. It's not built for the purpose of really thinking about policy development or revolutionary kinds of change or organizing that has to take place to sort of apply political pressure. There's ways that can be done and sort of take advantage of social media platforms and spaces to do that. But the other side is a kind of constant surveillance and intervention, and it's not a place that we control as a space, most individual users or activists or what have you. So we're always left to kind of act within the confines of what Facebook decides it wants to let its users do or not do, or the Twitter environment or other ones. So I'm kind of ambivalent about social media. I think it does a lot to put things in front of us and keep them top of mind and keep us talking. And I think that is big. But I think we have to look elsewhere for kind of real long-term sustainable solutions.
Will you expand a little bit on what you think the elsewhere is?
Yeah, I think either building new intentional, deliberate platforms. And, we see examples of some of these kind of creep up where, explicit environments are built for the purpose of, activist organizing and so forth, which of course has to be in some ways an open space to kind of get the level of participation that you want across a really diverse body of people who are sharing interests and are behind a cause, but some level of closure so as not to be, either co-opted or thwarted by the kind of powers that be that you're trying to push and change and so forth. So building new platforms or completely outside of, or at least a distance from the technological environment, simply into the policy and political arena itself, which is where I think a lot of these battles for change ultimately have to take place. And so how do we push that out of the social media realm to the other areas of local, state, federal governments, policy arenas. And it's not to say those are completely two different, distinct environments, but I think in some ways they are different domains. And so I think there has to be we have to create better social and internet infrastructure to do some of the things with those tools that we want to do online that are more disruptive. And then I think we have to see what else are we doing outside of the sort of the digital environment to push these things alongside it. It's this sort of, I love to see, I think this year I probably shouldn't, say this for the folks, I think it was in Missouri. I think it was William Lacey Clay in Missouri, longtime congressman, longtime political family, African-American family, but lost a primary this year to a young Black Lives Matter activist that was just like, look, we got to do some things differently. And so taking that sort of level of audacity and energy and so forth from that social media space into a different realm of acting and sort of exerting political influence. And I think that's what we have to see more and more of as well.
Yeah, one of our frequent guests on our conversations about racial justice and energy always makes the point that we're not going to have racially just policies until we have more politicians of color.
Right.
And how do we make that happen?
And it comes back to the question about representation, which for me is a big, complex issue because it means both having a kind of critical mass of people, which we don't see in government or in industry, et cetera, typically. But representation also really doesn't go beyond the limits of sort of who has power to make decisions, right? So I could have many people in a company who are diverse, but if none of them are in a position to really change drastically the course of a significant business decision, then what good has that done, right? And so I think both that sort of grassroots, but also representation at the higher echelons where we're talking about in a company or in government, we have to have significant representation to really make real change.
Yeah. I know we're at the top of the hour. Can I steal you for a couple more minutes? I have two more questions. Okay,
yep.
Thanks.
Perfectly.
Getting to the other part of the solution that you were talking about, which is creating different spaces for activists to collaborate and convene, share and develop new ideas on the internet, which harkens back to the Afronet that you talk about earlier in your book. It's really an organizing space for Black Americans. Do you think that a forum like Afronet would be allowed to persist in America these days?
It's a great question. I recently had the exact same question from a group of young people that I was doing a sort of book club with. Does it have value in our current context? Yes, absolutely. I think so. Could it survive and thrive in our current context? I'm not sure. I think the possibility is there. I think the need is there. I think the will is there for those who would benefit from it. But again, I think that requires a lot of capital resources and so forth to really develop, sustain, et cetera. And that's where I see this kind of skepticism of folks that say, what's the value in me sort of investing large sums of money in a space that I am told I can have no entry into or influence on. Like that's the level of possibility. And it has everything to do with that sort of interesting moment when, the Afronet ceases to be what it is and sort of the new web environment of your net noirs of the world or Black Planets at the time started to grow out of, which was this kind of, AOL had Net Noir, the competing company, CompuServe, was trying to transpose what was the Afronet into CompuServe's environment. And they went to those folks and said, hey, basically, can we do this other thing? And they said, yeah, but how about we do it this way? You give us the money and we'll do what we want. And that's how we're going to go. And CompuServe was sort of like, no, I had something different in mind, which is we take what you have built and we do it over here in our thing, and we profit from it.
And they would own all the content, right? That was part of that. Yeah.
Yep. And so they were like, yeah, no, we'll just out. And many of those people that were associated with the Afronet is sort of, when you talk about them to them in present day, they're like, yeah, that was sort of where things ended for me. Like there's no lingering digital creative imprint beyond that moment, because it just was sort of an abrupt end of, I'll use what I need, what I want for me, but in terms of something more and larger, if the only way for me to do that is giving up control and creativity and all these things and profit to someone else, I'll stick to doing something different or something altogether outside of that environment.
Yeah. And I want to end with, thinking a bit more about where you think we're at, when we look back at history, and where are we at right now with racial justice and these software internet tools. And there's a great quote in your book that I think was attributed to Timothy Jenkins in 1994, who was a publisher of American Visions. And he just says, the issues of access and inclusion, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but the issues of access and inclusion that have plagued Black Americans through the whole history of this country are now dressed in new technological clothing. And it was his call for big national action and political action around making sure that Black Americans aren't left out of this technological revolution. And also oppressed by it, by being left out of it, creates a pathway to oppress groups. Do you think that is the case with the current state of software development and the internet and the way that that's used as a tool in society? Or do you think that there has been progress towards meaningful inclusion?
I think the same state of affairs as Jenkins describes it is, I think describes our present perfectly. It looks different a little bit in terms of the array of technologies themselves and so forth, but I think it is still true that, there is a massive inclusion gap. And I think sort of as we look to the future of big, large scale technological developments and machine learning and AI and all these kinds of technologies, I find ourselves in a sort of a similar kind of crossroads that is either going to be towards greater inclusion, and inclusion in, the real sense of power, not just about sort of token representation, or this is, our first step on the pathway for a whole other sort of new generation of racial oppression that has technological tools at its service. So, I think we're at an opportune moment to go one way or another, and it's an entirely a set of choices that is in our power to make. And I think in the same way that those formative moments in the 1960s set us off on a trajectory technologically, racially, that has set up our sort of massive criminalization, surveillance, technological infrastructure that disparately impacts people of color. I think we're similarly at one of those crossroads to say, either we're going to make the choice now to invest in a vastly different course, or we're going to choose another one, and the one that we could choose, we know where it's headed because we've already been there, so we know where it's leading. So it's a moment to have in full view two potential courses, one where we know where it leads, and it's largely negative for large swaths of people across the country and across the world, or venture it into maybe a new and uncharted territory, but one that is deliberately designed to say, can we do something different, better, and responsive to those who have typically been left out and oppressed by technological systems, in no matter what form they take place, whether they're computing technology or other forms of technology that have always been part of who we are and how we work as societies.
And getting to that better future that we all hope for will come through really, I think, a big focus and push, as you're saying, on regulation broadly around this new technology space, but regulating it in a way where we have to understand what are the likely outcomes and impacts on society. So it's a big push for the regulations and policies that enable us to achieve, or at least evaluate for, racial justice as a likely outcome. And big investment into Black entrepreneurs in the technology space to help us get to the next frontier, the next disruption, the next opportunity. Yeah, is that?
Absolutely. If we just had those two things as goals, I think that could keep us busy for the next couple of decades, and trying to do it right, and so forth. I think those are two perfect places to begin thinking about doing things vastly differently, with very different outcomes that are more equitable, sustainable, humane, and where I think most of us really want to go. And I think, I don't see the drawbacks in the lack of will and wanting to get to this place. It's the lack of will to do the things that we have to do to get there. I think that's where we're still sort of grappling with, is this revolutionary kinds of change that's going to be really disruptive, but really will live in a different place? Or will it be kind of what we typically experience, which is, all right, let's tweak this thing over here a little bit and maybe in a positive way. And, 10 years from now, maybe things have changed a little bit, but not wholesalely in the kind of structural systemic ways that we need. So I think that's where we're sort of at, which is, we know where we want to go. We know what we want to do. In some respects, we know what it will take to sort of get there. And then it's, how do we make that shift, and how do we make ourselves comfortable with making that shift, and how do we sort of change and shift gears institutionally and so forth, to do things that are disruptive. And I think I love always to end with someone from the book who has been very influential, both in terms of writing the book, but someone I continue a relationship with now, who is Kamal Al-Mansour, who was someone who started off his career in the legal area, but working at Jet Propulsion Labs, looked around the environment in the mid 80s and said, what, there's nothing and no one like me here. And I want that to be different, because I can see the way in which technology is going to have an outsized influence on our society and our life. And I want to do something about that. Jumped ship, became an entrepreneur, bootstrapped his own business, was very successful. And when he had that meeting that you sort of referenced with Timothy Jenkins in Washington, D.C., with the Congressional Black Caucus, he came along with other Black folks that were in the technology space then, and he left disgruntled. And he said, I came here because I thought it was going to be disruptive. I thought we were about to plot the revolution. I thought we were going to do something different. And all I found were just a lot of people that just wanted to make some more money or wanted to go make IBM even bigger and larger. And that's not what I was here to do. I was here to make change. And he quit right then and there, dropped what was a lucrative business and said, I'm done. But I think that's where we're at this moment. It's sort of either, go big or go home. We know what needs to be done. We know what the implications are. If we don't do it, why don't we just sort of figure out how to make it happen?
This is a great way to end.
Yeah.
Very much.
I'm always happy to come back to. This is fascinating, and I'm always interested in sort of new industries that I know and I'm less familiar about, and thinking about and through these issues in sort of those industry specific ways. So always happy to come back anytime.
Thanks. We'll be taking you up on that. It was so good to see you, Charlton. I hope you have a great holiday.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for everyone coming and attending and joining. Even if I can't see you, I know you're out there somewhere. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Yes, thanks everybody for joining us, and hope everybody out there has a good holiday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.